Chapter 1, Nightmare. When my mother was pregnant with me, she told me later, a party of Ku Klux Klan riders galloped to our home in Omaha, Nebraska one night. Surrounding the house, brandishing their shotguns and rifles, they shouted for my father to come out. My mother went to the front door and opened it. Standing where they could see her pregnant condition, she told them that she was alone with her 3 small children and that my father was away preaching in Milwaukee. The Klansmen shouted threats and warnings at her that we had better get out of town because the good Christian white people were not going to stand for my father's spreading trouble among the good Negroes of Omaha with the Back to Africa preachings of Marcus Garvey. My father, the Reverend Earl Little, was a Baptist minister, a dedicated organizer for Marcus Aurelius Garvey's UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. With the help of such disciples as my father, Garvey, from his headquarters in New York City's Harlem, was raising the banner of black race purity and exhorting the Negro masses to return to their ancestral African homeland, a cause which had made Garvey the most controversial black man on earth. Still shouting threats, the Klansmen finally spurred their horses and galloped around the house, shattering every window pane with their gun butts. Then they rode off into the night, their torches flaring as suddenly as they had come. My father was enraged when he returned. He decided to wait until I was born, which would be soon, and then the family would move. I am not sure why he made this decision, for he was not a frightened Negro as most then were, and many still are today. My father was a big 6'4", very black man. He had only one eye. How he lost the other one I have never known. He was from Reynolds, Georgia, where he had left school after 3rd or maybe 4th grade. He believed, as did Marcus Garvey, that freedom, independence, and self-respect could never be achieved by the Negro in America, and that therefore the Negro should leave America to the white man and return to his African land of origin. Among the reasons my father had decided to risk and dedicate his life to help disseminate this philosophy among his people was that he had seen 4 of his 6 brothers die by violence, 3 of them killed by white men, including one by lynching. What my father could not know then was that of the remaining 3, including himself, only one, my Uncle Jim, would die in bed of natural causes. Northern white police were later to shoot my Uncle Oscar, and my father was finally himself to die by the white man's hands. It has always been my belief that I, too, will die by violence. I have done all that I can to be prepared. I was my father's 7th child. He had 3 children by a previous marriage, Ella, Earl, and Mary, who lived in Boston. He had met and married my mother in Philadelphia, where their first child, my oldest full brother, Wilfred, was born. They moved from Philadelphia to Omaha, where Hilda and Filbert were born. I was next in line. My mother was 28 when I was born on May 19, 1925, in an Omaha hospital. Then we moved to Milwaukee, where Reginald was born. From infancy, he had a kind of hernia condition which was to handicap him physically for the rest of his life. Louise Little, my mother, was born in Grenada, in the British West Indies, looked like a white woman. Her father was white. She had straight black hair, and her accent did not sound like a Negro's. Of this white father of hers, I know nothing except her shame about it. I remember hearing her say she was glad that she had never seen him. It was, of course, because of him I got my reddish-brown marony color of skin, and my hair the same color. I was the lightest child in our family. Out in the world later on in Boston and New York, I was among the millions of Negroes who were insane enough to feel that it was some kind of status symbol to be light-complexioned, the one that was actually fortunate to be born thus. But still later I learned to hate every drop of that white rapist's blood that is in me. Our family stayed only briefly in Milwaukee, for my father wanted to find a place where he could raise our own food and perhaps build a business. The teaching of Marcus Garvey stressed becoming independent of the white man. We went next for some reason to Lansing, Michigan. My father bought a house, and soon, as had been his pattern, he was doing freelance Christian preaching in local Negro Baptist churches, and during the week he was roaming about spreading word of Marcus Garvey. He had begun to lay away savings for the store he had always wanted to own when, as always, some stupid local Uncle Tom Negroes began to funnel stories about his revolutionary beliefs to the local white people. This time, the get-out-of-town threats came from a local hate society called the Black Legion. They wore black robes instead of white. Soon, nearly everywhere my father went, Black Legionnaires were reviling him as an uppity nigger for wanting to own a store, for living outside the Lansing Negro District, for spreading unrest and dissension among the good niggers. As in Omaha, my mother was pregnant again, this time with my youngest sister. Shortly after Yvonne was born came the nightmare night in 1929, my earliest vivid memory. I remember being suddenly snatched awake into a frightening confusion of pistol shots and shouting and smoke and flames. My father had shouted and shot at the two white men who had set the fire and were running away. Our home was burning down around us. We were lunging and bumping and tumbling all over each other trying to escape. My mother, with the baby in her arms, just made it into the yard before the house crashed in, showering sparks. I remember we were outside in the night, in our underwear, crying and yelling our heads off. The white police and firemen came and stood around us, watching as the house burned to the ground. My father prevailed on some friends to clothe and house us temporarily. Then he moved us into another house on the outskirts of East Lansing. In those days, Negroes weren't allowed after dark in East Lansing proper. That's where Michigan State University is located. I related all of this to an audience of students when I spoke there in January 1963 and had the first reunion in a long time with my younger brother Robert, who was there doing postgraduate studies in psychology. I told them how East Lansing harassed us so much that we had to move again, this time 2 miles out of town into the country. This is where my father built for us with his own hands a 4-room house. This is where I really begin to remember things, this home where I started to grow up. After the fire, I remember that my father was called in and questioned about a permit for the pistol with which he had shot at the white men who set the fire. I remember that the police were always dropping by our house, shoving things around, just checking or looking for a gun. The pistol they were looking for, which they never found, and for which they wouldn't issue a permit, was sewed up inside a pillow. My father's .22 rifle and his shotgun, though, were right out in the open. Everyone had them for hunting birds and rabbits and other game. After that, my memories are of the friction between my father and mother. They seemed to be nearly always at odds. Sometimes my father would beat her. It might have had something to do with the fact that my mother had a pretty good education. Where she got it, I don't know, but an educated woman, I suppose, can't resist the temptation to correct an uneducated man. Every now and then, when she put those smooth words on him, he would grab her. My father was also belligerent toward all of the children, except me. The older ones he would beat almost savagely if they broke any of his rules, and he had so many rules it was hard to know them all. Nearly all my whippings came from my mother. I've thought a lot about why. I actually believe that as anti-white as my father was, he was subconsciously so afflicted with the white man's brainwashing of Negroes that he inclined to favor the light ones, and I was his lightest child. Most Negro parents in those days would almost instinctively treat any lighter children better than they did the darker ones. It came directly from the slavery tradition that the mulatto, because he was visibly nearer to white, was therefore better. My 2 other images of my father were both outside the home. One was his role as a Baptist preacher. He never pastored in any regular church of his own. He was always a visiting preacher. I remember especially his favorite sermon. That little black train is a-comin', and you better get all your business right. I guess this also fit his association with the Back to Africa movement, with Marcus Garvey's black train homeward. My brother Filbert, the one just older than me, loved church, but it confused and amazed me. I would sit, goggle-eyed, at my father jumping and shouting as he preached, with the congregation jumping and shouting behind him, their souls and bodies devoted to singing and praying. Even at that young age, I just couldn't believe in the Christian concept of Jesus as someone divine. And no religious person, until I was a man in my 20s and then in prison, could tell me anything. I had very little respect for most people who represented religion. It was in his role as a preacher that my father had most contact with the Negroes of Lansing. Believe me when I tell you that those Negroes were in bad shape then. They are still in bad shape, though in a different way. By that I mean I don't know a town with a higher percentage of complacent, misguided, so-called middle-class Negroes, the typical status symbol-oriented, integration-seeking type Negroes. Just recently I was standing in a lobby at the United Nations, talking with an African ambassador and his wife, when a Negro came up to me and said, "You know me?" I was a little embarrassed because I thought he was someone I should remember. It turned out that he was one of those bragging, self-satisfied, middle-class, Lansing Negroes. I wasn't ingratiated. He was the type who would never have been associated with Africa until the fad of having African friends became a status symbol for middle-class Negro. Back when I was growing up, the successful Lansing Negroes were such as waiters and bootblacks. To be a janitor at some downtown store was to be highly respected. The real elite, the big shots, the voices of the race, were the waiters at the Lansing Country Club and the shoeshine boys at the state capitol. The only Negroes who really had any money were the ones in the numbers racket, or who ran the gambling houses, or who in some other way lived parasitically off the poorest ones, who were the masses. No Negroes were hired then by Lansing's big Oldsmobile plant or the Rio plant. Do you remember the Rio? It was manufactured in Lansing, and R.E. Olds, the man after whom it was named, also lived in Lansing. When the war came along, they hired some Negro janitors. The bulk of the Negroes were either on welfare or WPA, or they starved. The day was to come when our family was so poor that we would eat the whole out of a donut. But at that time, we were much better off than most town Negroes. The reason was that we raised much of our own food out there in the country where we were. We were much better off than the town Negroes who would shout as my father preached for the pie in the sky and their heaven in the hereafter, while the white man had his here on earth. I knew that the collections my father got for his preaching were mainly what fed and clothed us, and he also did other odd jobs, but still the image of him that made me proudest was his crusading and militant campaigning with the words of Marcus Garvey. As young as I was then, I knew from what I overheard that my father was saying something that made him a tough man. I remember an old lady grinning and saying to my father, "You're scaring these white folks to death." One of the reasons I've always felt that my father favored me was that, to the best of my remembrance, it was only me that he sometimes took with him to the Garvey UNIA meetings, which he held quietly in different people's homes. There were never more than a few people at any one time, 20 at most, but that was a lot packed into someone's living room. I noticed how differently they all acted, although sometimes they were the same people who jumped and shouted in church. But in these meetings, both they and my father were more intense, more intelligent, and down to earth. It made me feel the same way. I can remember hearing of Adam driven out of the garden into the caves of Europe, Africa for the Africans, Ethiopians awake. And my father would talk about how it would not be much longer before Africa would be completely run by Negroes, by black men, was the phrase he always used. No one knows when the hour of Africa's redemption cometh. It is in the wind, it is coming, one day like a storm it will be here. I remember seeing the big, shiny photographs of Marcus Garvey that were passed from hand to hand. My father had a big envelope of them that he always took to these meetings. The pictures showed what seemed to me millions of Negroes thronged in parade behind Garvey riding in a fine car. A big black man dressed in a dazzling uniform with gold braid on it. And he was wearing a thrilling hat with tall plumes. I remember hearing that he had black followers not only in the United States but all around the world. And I remember how the meetings always closed with my father saying several times, and the people chanting after him, "Up, you mighty race! You can accomplish what you will." I have never understood why, after hearing as much as I did of these kinds of things, I somehow never thought then of the black people in Africa. My image of Africa at that time was of naked savages, cannibals, monkeys, and tigers in steaming jungles. My father would drive his old black touring car, sometimes taking me to meeting places all around the Lansing area. I remember one daytime meeting, most were at night, in the town of Owasso, 40 miles from Lansing, which the Negroes called White City. Owasso's greatest claim to fame is that it is the hometown of Thomas E. Dewey. As in East Lansing, no Negroes were allowed on the streets there after dark, hence the daytime meeting. In point of fact, in those days, lots of Michigan towns were like that. Every town had a few home Negroes who lived there. Sometimes it would be just one family, as in the nearby county seat, Mason, which had a single Negro family named Lyons. Mr. Lyons had been a famous football star at Mason High School and was highly thought of in Mason, and consequently, he now worked around that town in menial jobs. My mother at this time seemed to be always working, cooking, washing, ironing, cleaning, and fussing over us 8 children. And she was usually either arguing with or not speaking to my father. One cause of friction was that she had strong ideas about what she wouldn't eat and didn't want us to eat, including pork and rabbit, both of which my father loved dearly. He was a real Georgia Negro, and he believed in eating plenty of what we in Harlem today call soul food. I have said that my mother was the one who whipped me. At least she did whenever she wasn't ashamed to let the neighbors think she was killing me. For even if she acted as though she was about to raise her hand to me, I would open my mouth and let the world know about it. If anybody was passing by out on the road, she would either change her mind or just give me a few licks. Thinking about it now, I feel definitely that just as my father favored me for being lighter than the other children, my mother gave me more hell for the same reason. She was very light herself, but she favored the ones who were darker. Wilfred, I know, was particularly her angel. I remember that she would tell me to get out of the house and let the sun shine on you so you can get some color. She went out of her way to never let me become afflicted with a sense of color superiority. I am sure that she treated me this way partly because of how she came to be light herself. I learned early that crying out in protest could accomplish things. My older brothers and sisters had started to school when sometimes they would come in and ask for a buttered biscuit or something, and my mother impatiently would tell them no. But I would cry out and make a fuss until I got what I wanted. I remember well how my mother asked me why I couldn't be a nice boy like Wilfred, but I would think to myself that Wilfred, for being so nice and quiet, often stayed hungry. So early in life, I had learned that if you want something, you had better make some noise. Not only did we have our big garden, but we raised chickens. My father would buy some baby chicks, and my mother would raise them. We all loved chicken. That was one dish there was no argument with my father about. One thing in particular that I remember made me feel grateful toward my mother was that one day I went and asked her for my own garden, and she did let me have my own little plot. I loved it and took care of it well. I loved especially to grow peas. I was proud when we had them on our table. I would pull out the grass in my garden by hand when the first little blades came up. I would patrol the rows on my hands and knees for any worms and bugs, and I would kill and bury them. And sometimes when I had everything straight and clean for my things to grow, I would lie down on my back between 2 rows, and I would gaze up in the blue sky at the clouds moving and think all kinds of things. At 5, I too began to go to school, leaving home in the morning along with Wilfred, Hilda, and Filbert. It was the Pleasant Grove school that went from kindergarten through 8th grade. It was 2 miles outside the city limits, and I guess there was no problem about our attending because we were the only Negroes in the area. In those days, white people in the North usually would adopt just a few Negroes. They didn't see them as any threat. The white kids didn't make any great thing about us either. They called us nigger and darky and rassed us so much that we thought those were our natural names. But they didn't think of it as an insult. It was just the way they thought about us. One afternoon in 1931, when Wilfred, Hilda, Filbert, and I came home, my mother and father were having one of their arguments. There had been lately a lot of tension around the house because of Black Legion threats. Anyway, my father had taken one of the rabbits which we were raising and ordered my mother to cook it. We raised rabbits, but sold them to whites. My father had taken a rabbit from the rabbit pen. He had pulled off the rabbit's head. He was so strong, he needed no knife to behead chickens or rabbits. With one twist of his big black hands, he simply twisted off the head and threw the bleeding, naked thing back at my mother's feet. My mother was crying. She started to skin the rabbit, preparatory to cooking it. But my father was so angry, he slammed on out of the front door and started walking up the road toward town. It was then that my mother had this vision. She had always been a strange woman in this sense and had always had a strong intuition of things about to happen, and most of her children were the same way, I think. When something is about to happen, I can feel something, sense something. I have never known something to happen that has caught me completely off guard except once, and that was when, years later, I discovered facts I couldn't believe about a man who, up until that discovery, I would gladly have given my life for. My father was well up the road when my mother ran screaming out onto the porch. "Early! Early!" She screamed his name. She clutched up her apron in one hand and ran down across the yard and into the road. My father turned around. He saw her. For some reason, considering how angry he had been when he left, he waved at her, but he kept on going. She told me later, my mother did, that she had a vision of my father's end. All the rest of the afternoon, she was not herself, crying and nervous and upset. She finished cooking the rabbit and put the whole thing in the warmer pot of the black stove. When my father was not back home by our bedtime, my mother hugged and clutched us, and we felt strange, not knowing what to do, because she had never acted like that. I remember waking up to the sound of my mother's screaming again. When I scrambled out, I saw the police in the living room. They were trying to calm her down. She had snatched on her clothes to go with them, and all of us children who were staring knew, without anyone having to say it, that something terrible had happened to our father. My mother was taken by the police to the hospital and to a room where a sheet was over my father in a bed, and she wouldn't look. She was afraid to look. Probably it was wise that she didn't. My father's skull on one side was crushed in, I was told later. Negroes in Lansing have always whispered that he was attacked and then laid across some tracks for a streetcar to run over him. His body was cut almost in half. He lived 2.5 hours in that condition. Negroes then were stronger than they are now, especially Georgia Negroes. Negroes born in Georgia had to be strong simply to survive. It was morning when we children at home got the word that he was dead. I was 6. I can remember a vague commotion. The house filled up with people crying, saying bitterly that the White-Black Legion had finally gotten him. My mother was hysterical. In the bedroom, women were holding smelling salts under her nose. She was still hysterical at the funeral. I don't have a very clear memory of the funeral either. Oddly, the main thing I remember is that it wasn't in a church, and that surprised me, since my father was a preacher and I had been where he preached people's funerals in churches, but his was in a funeral home. And I remember that during the service, a big black fly came down and landed on my father's face, and Wilfred sprang up from his chair and he shooed the fly away, and he came groping back to his chair. There were folding chairs for us to sit on, and the tears were streaming down his face. When we went by the casket, I remember that I thought it looked as if my father's strong black face had been dusted with flour, and I wished they hadn't put on such a lot of it. Back in the big 4-room house, there were many visitors for another week or so. They were good friends of the family, such as the Lyons from Mason, 12 miles away, and the Walkers, McGuires, Liscos, the Greens, Randolphs and the Turners and others from Lansing, and a lot of people from other towns whom I had seen at the Garvey meetings. We children adjusted more easily than our mother did. We couldn't see as clearly as she did the trials that lay ahead. As the visitors tapered off, she became very concerned about collecting the 2 insurance policies that my father had always been proud he carried. He had always said that families should be protected in case of death. One policy apparently paid off without any problem, the smaller one. I don't know the amount of it. I would imagine it was not more than $1,000 and maybe half of that. But after that money came and my mother had paid out a lot of it for the funeral and expenses, she began going into town and returning very upset. The company that had issued the bigger policy was balking at paying off. They were claiming that my father had committed suicide. Visitors came again, and there was bitter talk about white people. How could my father bash himself in the head, then get down across the streetcar tracks to be run over? So there we were. My mother was 34 years old now, with no husband, no provider or protector to take care of her 8 children. But some kind of family routine got going again, and for as long as the first insurance money lasted, we did all right. Wilfred, who was a pretty stable fellow, began to act older than his age. I think he had the sense to see when the rest of us didn't what was in the wind for us. He quietly quit school and went to town in search of work. He took any kind of job he could find, and he would come home dog-tired in the evenings and give whatever he had made to my mother. Hilda, who had been quiet too, attended to the babies. Filbert and I didn't contribute anything. We fought all the time, each other at home, and then at school we would team up and fight white kids. Sometimes the fights would be racial in nature, but they might be about anything. Reginald came under my wing since he had grown out of the toddling stage. He and I had become very close. I suppose I enjoyed the fact that he was the little one under me who looked up to me. My mother began to buy on credit. My father had always been very strongly against credit. Credit is the first step into debt and back into slavery, he had always said. And then she went to work herself. She would go into Lansing to find different jobs in housework or sewing for white people. They didn't realize, usually, that she was a Negro. A lot of white people around there didn't want Negroes in their houses. She would do fine until some way or other it got to people who she was, whose widow she was, and then she would be let go. I remember how she used to come home crying, but trying to hide it, because she had lost a job that she needed so much. Once when one of us, I cannot remember which, had to go for something to where she was working, and the people saw us and realized she was actually a Negro, she was fired on the spot. And she came home crying, this time not hiding it. When the state welfare people began coming to our house, we would come from school sometimes and find them talking with our mother, asking 1,000 questions. They acted and looked at her and at us and around in our house in a way that had about it the feeling, at least for me, that we were not people. In their eyesight, we were just things, that was all. My mother began to receive 2 checks, a welfare check and, I believe, a widow's pension. The checks helped, but they weren't enough, as many of us as there were. When they came about the first of the month, one always was already owed in full, if not more, to the man at the grocery store. And after that, the other one didn't last long. We began